Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are beginning Evicted by Matthew Desmond. Some people might pronounce that evicted. I always pronounced it evicted. Uh, it is entitled Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City. So let's dive in. Prologue, Cold City. Jory and his cousin were cutting up, tossing snowballs at passing cars. From Jory's street corner on Milwaukee's near south side, cars driving on 6th Street past squat duplexes with porch steps ending at a sidewalk edged in dandelions. Those heading north approached the Basilica of St. Josephat, whose crowning dome looked to Jory like a giant overturned plunger. It was January of 2008, and the city was experiencing the snowiest winter on record. Every so often, a car turned off 6th Street to navigate Arthur Avenue, hemmed in by the snow, and that's when the boys would take aim. Jory packed a tight one and let it fly. The car jerked to a stop, and a man jumped out. The boys ran inside and locked the door to the apartment where Jory lived with his mother, Arlene, and younger brother, Jafaris. The lock was cheap, and the man broke down the door with a few hard-heeled kicks. He left before anything else happened. When the landlord found out about the door, she decided to evict Arlene and her boys. They had been there for 8 months. The day Arlene and her boys had to be out was cold. But if she waited any longer, the landlord would summon the sheriff, who would arrive with a gun, a team of butt-footed movers, and a folded judge's order saying her house was no longer hers. She would be given 2 options, truck or curb. Quote, truck, end quote, would mean that her things would be loaded into an 18-footer and later checked into bonded storage. She could get everything back after paying $350. Arlene didn't have $350, so she would have opted for, quote, curb, end quote, which would mean watching the movers pile everything onto the sidewalk. Her mattresses, a floor model television, her copy of Don't Be Afraid to Discipline, her nice glass dining table, and the lace tablecloth that fit just so. Silk plants, Bibles, the meat cuts in the freezer, the shower curtain, Jafari's asthma machine. Arlene took her sons, Jory was 13, Jafaris was 5, to a homeless shelter, which everyone called the Lodge, so you could tell your kids, quote, we're staying at the Lodge tonight, end quote, like it was a motel. The 2-story stucco building could have passed for one, except for all the Salvation Army signs. Arlene stayed in the 120-bed shelter until April, when she found a house on 19th and Hampton, in the predominantly black inner city on Milwaukee's north side, not far from her childhood home. It had thick trim around the windows and doors and was once Kendall green, but the paint had faded and chipped so much over the years that the bare wood siding was now exposed, making the house look camouflaged. At one point, someone had started repainting the house plain white but had given up mid-brushstroke, leaving more than half unfinished. There was often no water in the house, and Jory had to bucket out what was in the toilet. But Arlene loved that it was spacious and set apart from other houses. Quote, it was quiet, end quote, she remembered. Quote, and $525 for a whole house, 2 bedrooms upstairs and 2 bedrooms downstairs. It was my favorite place, end quote. Yeah, my fault if I drank that. I took a drink of water. I hope that wasn't too loud on the microphone. After a few weeks, the city found Arlene's favorite place, quote, unfit for human habitation, end quote. Removed her, nailed green boards over the windows and doors, and issued a fine to her landlord. Arlene moved Jory and Jafaris into a drab apartment complex deeper in the inner city on Atkinson Avenue, which she soon learned was a haven for drug dealers. She feared for her boys, especially Jory, slack-shouldered, with pecan brown skin and a beautiful smile, who would talk to anyone. Arlene endured 4 summer months on Atkinson before moving into a bottom duplex unit on 13th Street and Keith, a mile away. She and the boys walked their things over. Arlene held her breath and tried the lights, smiling with relief when they came on. She could live off someone else's electricity bill for a while. There was a fist-sized hole in the living room window, The front door had to be locked with an ugly wooden plank dropped into metal brackets, and the carpet was filthy and ground in. But the kitchen was spacious and the living room well lit. Arlene stuffed a piece of clothing into the window and hung ivory curtains. The rent was $550 a month, utilities not included, the going rate in 2008 for a 2-bedroom unit in one of the worst neighborhoods in America's fourth poorest city. Arlene couldn't find a cheaper place, at least not one fit for human habitation, and most landlords wouldn't rent her a smaller one on account of her boys. The rent would take 88% of Arlene's $628 a month welfare check. Maybe she could make it work. Maybe they could at least stay through winter until crocuses and tulips stabbed through the thawed ground of spring, Arlene's favorite season. There was a knock at the door. It was the landlord, Sherner Tarver. Sharina, a black woman with bobbed hair and fresh nails, was loaded down with groceries. She had spent $40 of her own money and picked up the rest at a food pantry. She knew Arlene needed it. Arlene thanked Sharina and closed the door. Things were off to a good start. And then that brings us to a sort of a changing of the theme within this prologue. And already what stands out to me is, as you can tell, this book is going to be about people who are dealing with housing issues or housing problems or issues with finding housing or issues with dealing with housing, so it's just centered around housing and poverty. But one of the things that stands out to me is I remember when I first started getting involved with the struggle against police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice in Winnebago County. One of the things people would talk about a lot of times is how evictions were a form of police brutality. And I didn't really understand what that meant when I first heard it. And I think one of the reasons that I personally use the term police terrorism is because it all of these actions have political ramifications and political connotations to them, and also it broadens a person's perspective of how wide these things reach. And so when you use the word brutality, there's not always necessarily what might be considered brutal in the methodology that is happening when certain police terrorism tactics are taking place. But just the fact that, the first thing she said when she talked about the police coming was they would have guns. Let me see if I can find it. Arrive with the gun, and so like just the fact that he would come with the gun, it initiates. First thing that it does is when the police are brought into situations, it escalates the situation. If you are from a group of people who are routinely on the negative end of police interactions, then it also puts you in a position of intimidation in some sense. There, it puts you in it's a method of coercion because of the fact that violence is being brought into the equation, state-sanctioned violence, which is not the same thing as, this is violence that can be done against you and it's nothing you can do to stop it. And so I say all that to say that when you look at it in that type of a way, now years removed from first hearing it be proposed that evictions are a form of police brutality, I understand that concept. I understand what it means. And so just that quickly, we're reminded of how wide-ranging the concept of police terrorism is and how many things go into it. And it reminds you of all the different things we've read where people have spoken about how these police are used to maintain a certain order, to maintain a certain status quo, to keep certain people oppressed and exploited. And you see in this situation here how the police are used. Okay, let's continue reading. Even in the most desolate areas of American cities, evictions used to be rare. They used to draw crowds. Eviction riots erupted during the Depression, even though the number of poor families who faced eviction each year was a fraction of what it is today. A New York Times account of community resistance to the eviction of 3 Bronx families in February 1932 observed, quote, "Probably because of the code, the crowd numbered only 1,000, end quote. Sometimes neighbors confronted the marshals directly, sitting on the evicted family's furniture to prevent its removal or moving the family back in despite the judge's order. The marshals themselves were ambivalent about carrying out evictions. It wasn't why they carried a badge and a gun. These days, there are sheriff squads whose full-time job is to carry out eviction and foreclosure orders. There are moving companies specializing in evictions, their crews working all day, every weekday. There are hundreds of data mining companies that sell landlords tenant screening reports listing past evictions and court filings. These days, housing courts swell, forcing commissioners to settle cases in hallways or makeshift offices crammed with old desks and broken file cabinets. And most tenants don't even show up. Low-income families have grown used to the rumble of moving trucks, the early morning knocks at the door, the belongings lining the curb. Families have watched their incomes stagnate or even fall, while their housing costs have soared. Today, the majority of poor renting families in America spend over half of their income on housing, and at least 1 in 4 dedicates over 70% to paying the rent and keeping the lights on. Millions of Americans are evicted every year because they can't make rent. In Milwaukee, a city of fewer than 105,000 renter households, landlords evict roughly 16,000 adults and children each year. That's 16 families evicted throughout the court system daily. But there are other ways, cheaper and quicker ways, for landlords to remove a family than through the court order. Some landlords pay tenants a couple $100s to leave by the end of the week. Some take off the front door. Nearly half of all forced moves experienced by renting families in Milwaukee are, quote, informal evictions, end quote, that take place in the shadow of the law. If you count all forms of involuntary displacement, formal and informal evictions, landlord foreclosures, building condemnations, you discover that between 2009 and 2011, more than 1 in 8 Milwaukee renters experienced a forced move. There is nothing special about Milwaukee when it comes to eviction. The numbers are similar in Kansas City, Cleveland, Chicago, and other cities. In 2013, 1 in 8 poor renting families nationwide were unable to pay all of their rent, and a similar number thought it was likely they would be evicted soon. This book is set in Milwaukee, but it tells an American story. Evicted follows 8 families, some black, some white, some with children, some without, swept up in the process of eviction. The evictions take place throughout the city, embroiling not only landlords and tenants, but also kin and friends, lovers and ex-lovers, judges and lawyers, dope suppliers, and church elders. Evictions fallout is severe. Losing a home sends families to shelters, abandoned houses, and the street. It invites depression and illness, compels families to move into degrading housing in dangerous neighborhoods, uproots communities, and harms children. Eviction reveals people's vulnerability and desperation, as well as their ingenuity and guts. Fewer and fewer families can afford a roof over their head. This is among the most urgent and pressing issues facing America today, and acknowledging the breadth and depth of the problem changes the way we look at poverty. For decades, we focused mainly on jobs, public assistance, parenting, and mass incarceration. No one can deny the importance of these issues, but something fundamental is missing. We have failed to fully appreciate how deeply housing is implicated in the creation of poverty. Not everyone living in a distressed neighborhood is associated with gang members, parole officers, employers, social workers, or pastors, but nearly all of them have a landlord. And that brings us to the beginning of the book outside of the prologue, and that seems to be broken up in parts, and part 1 is entitled Rent. And chapter 1 is entitled The Business of Owning the City, which we will begin on the next episode of Rockford Reading Daily. One of the things I'm going to try to do my best of is, I'm not sure how long the chapters are, but I've been trying to get better at putting all the chapters into one or putting the entire chapter into one episode. And if the whole chapter can't be in one episode, breaking up the chapter into 2 or 3 episodes and ending an episode once a chapter is finished instead of having an episode which consists of multiple chapters. So we will end this here. We will begin tomorrow, continuing to read Evicted. I think what stands out for me for the last passage that we read is just recalling my experience with eviction court. I was once evicted out of an apartment in 2000. Oof, man, can't remember the year. Maybe 2019. Oh, 2000. Yeah, 2019. And it was at the time. It was again. I was not very conscious of some of the issues that existed around police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. But I do remember this feeling of powerlessness, of hopelessness. That it was just I was just going through the motions, and it was really nothing I could do to stop this from happening. That I didn't really have any type of power in my hands. The person basically who's assigned to be your lawyer, your representative in there is basically just trying to get you to sign off and move on, just like with many other court proceedings that take place within the system. And the numbers were very staggering of how many people get evicted, the different manners of eviction, the informal evictions was something that I found enlightening. And for us here at the May 30th Alliance, we have always emphasized how important the issue of housing is when it comes to the issues of police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. It's one of the reasons that we've done when we did the Rockford readings, which you can find on Facebook and on YouTube. When we did our ongoing teaching in 2021, in April 2021, we read the book The Color of Law, which is about housing segregation, de jure and de facto segregation. It's the reason that earlier in this series, we read the book High Risers, which talks about the public housing issues in public housing, specifically in Chicago. And so it is why we will also now add Evicted to our curriculum, because we do understand the importance in that housing plays in all of these issues. So please share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on. Be on the lookout for tomorrow's episode of Rockford Reading Daily, where we will begin part 1, chapter 1 of Evicted. And I'm recording this on, what's the date? July 6th. Recording this on July 6th, 2022. Terry Patterson was just found not guilty on all charges at a trial that was being held for a false allegation of aggravated battery to Kyle Saunders. And I think that's something that's worth remembering, and something that's worth noting. So we are now 3-1 when it comes to 3-1 when it comes to trials, and we hoping to keep that one as our only loss. So please share this whatever platform you're listening to it on. Remember, we put these episodes out on a daily basis to provide you the opportunity to begin or further your journey in the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. And we will be back tomorrow. I'll let you then.